Here we are. Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience. We have very little time for our very exciting discussion, so we're going to get right into it. This is on journalism about identity. So I'm Jaweed Kaleem. I am a reporter for LA Times. I write about race and justice, so often on all kinds of identity groups, LGBTQ, racial, religious. To my right is Nasya Bahfen from Trobe University. She's a journalism professor who researches racism and identity and mobile journalism. We have Ethar al-Katatni, the co-founder and executive producer of AJ Plus, which is part of the Al Jazeera network of journalism outlets. And we have Yusuf Omar, the founder of #OurStories and a great promoter of mobile journalism. And you also use drones in your journalism, I've noticed. So we're going to show you one video from Yusuf, and later on, or in the panel, one more from Ethar about what identity journalism is and why we think it's important and useful. They'll intro them very quickly, and then we'll play Yusuf's.
Yeah, I was giving speeches very similar to this in the south of India for a number of days, and every speech I gave, there was no women on the panel, a little bit like some of the manels at this conference. But to make it worse, there was no woman in the audience either for 3 days in a row. And eventually I had the opportunity to meet women in this community, and they all wore the niqab. Their faces were completely covered. This is a story that's being told over and over again across Europe, but trying to find a different way to tell this story by enabling and training communities to tell the stories with their phones.
Hi. Hopefully the video that we're going to play is the one I wanted to. So at AJ Plus, we do a lot of character-driven stories in order to describe the issues that we should care about. Broadly, we look at things that are social justice. AJ Plus was built to the Al Jazeera ethos of voice of the voiceless, or those who we don't really want to listen to, who are actually silenced. So that usually includes minorities, persecuted, disenfranchised. We're very aware of the imbalance of power, whether that's political or economic, and then our priority is to highlight those voices to make sure that they do get the chance to talk about their issues and what's going on through their own voices. So the video that I'm hoping to play is an example of how we target contemporary with the news. So white nationalism in the United States, white supremacy. So to tell that story, we actually had a Holocaust survivor tell us about his story and what he understands and perceives of what's going on in the country. So we would do the same. So let's say North Korea, we would have someone from Nagasaki kind of tell us about right now the undocumented children. We would probably have someone who was also as a child grew up in a camp and tell us about those stories.
Thank you.
We're not allowed to do what we want to do.
From what age do the girls have to cover their face?
From 10 years.
I want to be a journalist.
A girl must be covered from head to feet as she reaches the adolescence.
Is this oppression or tradition? I was recently invited to Bhatkal in the south of India. It's a really conservative community of about 50,000 Muslims. And everywhere I went to speak, I asked the same question. Why are there no women in this room? There's not one woman in this room here today. Why were there no women here? And at every event, they gave the same answer.
There really isn't a lot of intermingling between the two sexes. One of the reasons why you haven't found a lot of them.
And then finally, I had the opportunity to do a workshop with a group of schoolgirls. Assalamu alaikum!
Wa alaikum salam!
What is this place called? Behind the veils, these are real girls with real names and real ambitions.
My name is Mazia. Umrah. Aina. Kulsum. Raja. Amara. Ilfa. Ilaf.
And what do you want to do when you finish school?
Doctor. Artist. Civil officer. Software engineer. Lawyer. Teacher.
Everybody wants to be a doctor in this room.
I want to be a journalist. I want to be a journalist.
But here is the problem.
We're not supposed to use social media.
Why?
Our elders don't allow us to use.
Why not?
Ask them.
What else are we not allowed?
We're not allowed to do what we want to do because it comes under our family's name. Because it says it's so-and-so's daughter, so-and-so's granddaughter. They're not allowed to do what we want to do.
This is rubbish. And what about the boys?
Boys, they're given more freedom than the girls.
And how are we going to fix it?
We'll have to try with the journalism.
I asked the girls what issues they had in their communities, and there were many. But the niqab, or the covering of the face, wasn't one of them.
And people think that we are forced to wear it, but that isn't the case.
Hijab is our choice. Hijab is not just a piece of cloth, it is a way of life.
We cover ourselves to avoid the unwanted gaze because face is the focus of temptation and desire.
Myself, Ariba, I would like to be called as a proud hijabi. Shukran.
But when I asked some of the men and teachers who work in the schools and madrasas if the niqab is compulsory, they said,
A girl must be covered from head to feet. During the time of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, they used to open only one eye so that they could see the road.
the niqab is a complicated issue. For some, it's a choice. For others, it seems like a cultural expectation.
Thank you for that great piece of journalism. Is the other video ready? Okay, and this is the one from AJ Plus, and I think it's a different video than the one this is an introductory video for it.
To the girl on Facebook who commented #AllLivesMatter.
Folks in the U.S. and around the world have watched Ferguson, Missouri in shock.
Can't breathe, hands up, can't breathe, hands up, can't breathe, hands up.
We're now at Hegya Shalom Station in Hungary, and these hundreds of refugees, they've been on this road since September 5th. It's now September 15th.
We're here in New Orleans, and it's been 10 years since Hurricane Katrina.
California's largest inland body of water used to cover where I'm standing.
We're in Paris, where world leaders at the UN Climate Conference.
So we were just visiting the asylum center that you were living in, and people got pretty upset when they saw our cameras. Can you tell us why?
Hey, we're with the man himself, Jon Stewart.
You have to carry that in a fanny pack.
We made it to the State House in the capital, Columbia, where the Confederate flag is flying. Is the South more racist?
South ain't racist, no.
Los peluqueros generalmente cortan por un lado y luego cortan por el otro. Y que siempre quedará siempre un lado diferente al otro.
Strangers lied 3 times within the first 10 minutes of meeting each other.
These days, it's a lot easier and takes fewer people to spy on one person, or spy on everyone for that matter.
You know, everybody loves your neighborhood teacher, but no one wants to pony up to pay us a salary where we can survive.
You don't feel anything, really. You feel very numb to any emotion.
My father was deported when I was in 10th grade.
So as a billionaire and as part of the 1%, how could you possibly represent, let alone relate to the remaining 99% of America?
What I relate to most is the middle class.
Socialism is a dirty word in American politics. It's lobbed at presidents to try and tear them down, and used by outsiders to set them apart.
Hey! 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 Hey!
If you put your name on this, they're going to destroy you.
Wow, what a powerful kind of overview of some really big stories that were both well covered and undercovered, from the presidential election to rape in India to the environment to health to war. We have 2 people who are creators of what you could call identity journalism, and just journalism, period. And we have one person, Nasya, here, who is a teacher of journalism, who actually uses these 2 publications in her teaching, and whose students do this kind of work and want to pursue this kind of work professionally around the world. So each of us obviously believes very strongly in covering the marginalized, the so-called voiceless, the people who, when it was only corporations led by white CEOs, were not covered or stereotyped and used as pawns in power games. So I want to open the floor to ask why it's important to cover people based upon their race, their gender, their sexuality, and tell these stories and tell it from their perspective and their own words, especially in video.
So my feeling is that traditional media is often designed to go for the most generic, universal story. And this partially is due to the way that the stories are constructed. You have a reporter speaking to somebody on one side of the story, one side of the other side. Take, for example, the niqab, playing out across France and Switzerland and across Europe. You speak to a right-wing nationalist who wants to ban the niqab. You speak to a Somalian woman making samosas who wants to wear the niqab. And that's how generic they paint this picture, when actually it's far more detailed than that. And if we can actually tap into these voices and a variety of voices, you learn that actually we're not all sort of a mother in a kitchen doing this. We represent a variety of ideals, and we also are far more similar than we are different to everybody else. We, like these young women you saw, they have a similar accent to you, they have a similar language, they also watch Game of Thrones. And that idea that engagement increases empathy. If you can engage with these people on a personal level, you start to empathize with them. If you isolate them, you further distance ourselves from them. But we've, for the longest of time, shot inwards. We've centralized the news gathering process. And this is about totally decentralizing it, about giving the autonomy and control over to the person to tell their story through their own voice.
Ethar.
I'd also add that when we began, one of the most, I think, revolutionary parts of our, other than like the innovation and how we produce the content and platform specific, is actually listening to your audience. Once we'd kind of, when we were piloting and we were like, our target are kind of millennials and Americans, and what are we, let's listen to our audience and engage with them and see the kind of stories they're interested in. We live in a world which has become extremely diverse, extremely saturated with content. There was a Pew study, I think a couple of weeks ago, which was talking about how I think the stat was 68% of people are sick of the news, myself included. And your challenge is you need to kind of tell people about the world and show them the world that is not statistics, that is not just, here's another airstrike in Yemen, here's another stat of how many people have been killed. And obviously the best ways in terms of journalism is your characters. And then when you find the intersection of identities that your audience can empathize with and understand, always when my producers pitch, I'm always like, why should I care? Why is your audience going to care about this story in Estonia, or Ireland? And you find the angle that brings, as you were saying, the shared humanity of them. And our identities have become so complex. The diverse newsrooms that we work in, I think, play a huge role in finding stories from their communities that you otherwise wouldn't have heard about. Because yes, we talk about voice of the voiceless, but no one is really voiceless, right? It's people who just can't find the avenues to tell their stories. But in order to access those people and amplify and give them those stories, you need to be part of those communities in order to know what the issues are. And in order to educate your audience and teach them, you need to let those people tell their own stories. We live in a very raw kind of, the video sphere and digital landscape has become very, that's a whole other kind of panel we can talk about. But you're constantly trying to find ways of how to make these stories to make them connect with your audience. And one of the best ways we have found, one of the stories that flickered by was teachers. That was actually one of our most viewed stories of all time, which was actually just having teachers talk about how difficult their lives are, having undocumented people, just literally no journalist. I know you saw a lot of journalists there, but most of our content actually doesn't have any presenter at all to talk about them. To find those stories, from Standing Rock to Ferguson, we actually launched during Ferguson, and just let people, when you were talking about Black Lives Matter, we just, sat next to someone in a car and have them talk about how they're afraid to drive while Black. We went to Alaska and then let indigenous, people talk about their stories. For every issue you choose, you both have to find not just your story selection, but the angle and the characters that then have your audience actually understand and empathize and connect with. And we found that the most successful way to tell any kind of journalism, any kind of story.
So I'll give you a little bit of background into why I specifically choose content from AJ Plus and #OurStories to teach my students. There's a disparity between the lived experiences of migrants and people of colour in Australia compared to the media. So Australia itself is very diverse, but if you were to take a look at the media, it appears as if Australia still exists in the 1950s when we had something called the White Australia policy. Right? So the media doesn't reflect the diversity of Australia. We're a country where nearly half of the population has at least one parent born overseas. Right? So the actual society itself is diverse. Our media doesn't reflect that. And for a whole heap of reasons, some of which Ethar was alluding to, we don't get a lot of journalists of colour. Right? So we don't get a lot of journalists who don't come from the predominant Anglo-Australian culture. And certainly my course features that. And has that sort of characteristic to it. I teach journalism and sports journalism. The university that I work at is situated in the second most populous state in Australia, and it's the only university that offers sports journalism as a major. Now, my entire course is mostly young white male students. That is not good, that is not bad. It's just what it is, right? That's the market for that degree. And for a whole host of reasons, you'll very rarely find people from Muslim backgrounds, from Indigenous Australian backgrounds, wanting to enter that particular field. Journalism is seen as incredibly masculine, incredibly macho, and incredibly closed off to diversity. So one of the most important things I do in my course, I think, is to play a video like the video that you just saw, which was created by #OurStories. And if you jump onto Facebook, you'll see that that particular video has been shared, I think, 3 million times. Is that correct? Yeah. So about 3 million times. And I asked my students to reflect on how this story would be told by the mainstream media in Australia. There's no right or wrong answer to that. Or to be more accurate, there are several correct answers. And one of the ones that comes up constantly, and they bring this up on their own, they say it's told completely differently to mainstream media in Australia. And one of the reasons that's so different is that it actually features the voices of Muslim women wearing the niqab. So similarly, again, to Ethar, if somebody pitches a story to me in terms of my students pitching their practical story to me, if it's a story that involves a culture that's foreign to their own, the first thing I say to them is, why is this your story to tell? If you're not Indigenous and you want to tell me a story about Aboriginal art, right, I want you to think about why this is your story to tell. And I'm not saying that you can't do that story, right? I'm not saying that that's not a story that you should be telling. But what I do want to know is who are you planning to speak to? Whose voices are you planning to privilege? Part of the work that I do in research is to take a look at the different interviewees that journalism students choose. And journalists do tend to be like sheep. They just follow each other and they go to the same sources again and again. And one of the areas that I try to get them to look at is if they are a straight person and they're doing a story about the LGBT community, or if they're doing a story on somebody who is trans, they better damn well have somebody who is from that aspect of life and somebody who identifies as trans in their list of proposed interviewees.
And I mean, if you take the case of Australia, for example, and there was these big, what can be called race riots, where the Lebanese community had frictions with some of the Aussie community, the Caucasian Australian community, and it ended up bubbling up into big fights and brawls on the beaches of Sydney. And this was a shock to so many Australians. But if there was journalism that was embedded in minorities, if there was journalism that really understood communities that are not well covered, that are not well documented, this wouldn't have been a surprise to anybody. This would have been tension points that were always there.
If AJ Plus had existed during that time, we could have had people who were affected by those stories telling those stories from the perspective not just of the predominantly white surf lifesavers who we heard from, but also the Lebanese Australians who felt threatened and who felt, their very existence as Australians was being questioned. That's, I guess, one of the really positive things about things like AJ Plus and #OurStories.
And one thing I would want to add, that it's really not hard to find these stories and these people if you really are making the effort. It really isn't. There are so many ways to access and to actually get those voices. It's not just a matter of like, well, we can't find them.
So Nasya and Ethar and Yusuf, you came to an important point for all of us in this room as, for the most part, working journalists. I'll give you a quick example. I live in Los Angeles. A lot of the big news in the US happens in Washington, D.C. and New York. I wake up, the news already happened. I have to cover it somehow. And then we also have deadlines that are earlier than most newspapers. So sometimes I have 1 hour to write an article for the newspaper and online. And you know, we have my area is race, so we have all sorts of issues around race in perpetuity in the United States. And the easiest thing is to go to the spokespeople that I already know, whose email and numbers I have, the sources I've interviewed before, the people who are easy to talk to, who will give me that soundbite that I know I can easily expect. What are some just simple tips to get out of that mode of thinking, or even convince your editors to wait one day, let's do a better job on this. Let's find the real people affected if there's a violence or state violence or war or all the list of you know, issues that affect humanity right now.
You have to find the angle that makes it a second-day story. Like, that's one thing in order to postpone a story that's a news story or really important. What's your added value that if we wait a day, who are you going to find for me to talk to? How is our story going to be different, that even though it's a second-day story, it's still a story of value and a story that we want to tell? Having a good engagement team is a lifesaver, and I know a lot of, especially legacy media, it's not something that's still very important. Doing call-outs, we have a really robust team to get those voices. We have people who, whether it's message or email or comment, who send and ask to be included in the stories, and that's where we find a lot of different stories. They actually come from our audience. Yeah, those are the first two.
I was just going to quickly say that's a core journalism skill, you know, to try and move the story along by finding a new voice. Most recent example of that was a moral panic in Melbourne about a spate. Apparently Melbourne was being overrun by young African gangs. So you can straight away tell where this is going. It was a bit of a beat up, and we heard from everyone. We heard from sociologists, we heard from Victoria Police. We didn't hear from young African men in Melbourne, you know, and if I were still a working journalist in a newsroom context...
They're all in the gangs, so
that's like the easiest way to move the story forward and to get a new angle is to actually reach out to a Sudanese or a Somalian or an Eritrean or an Ethiopian Australian and to talk about how the coverage of this supposed gang violence issue was affecting him or her.
So, I mean, one way to do it is to adjust the news gathering process and your engagement strategies. For me, the formatting makes a huge difference too. I'll give you an example. When I was working at CNN in London and the Ariana Grande attack happened, dozens of people were killed and injured, and we're doing the second day angle. If you open up your audience to that process by doing, say, live coverage very early on social and using that comment section to gather an idea of what's going on the ground, I did this, and I rapidly found out in the comment section of a live that I did that there was a Muslim family that had survived the Ariana Grande bombing, but then were being sort of treated really badly in public transport and around Manchester because now they were Muslims in a town where there'd just been an attack. So they were suffering Islamophobia even though they were survivors of the attack themselves. And we ended up going out there, and it was Ramadan at that time, and we did a Facebook Live for an hour and a half during Iftar, breaking fast with them. And this is something that was totally foreign to CNN. Facebook Live for Iftar, why on earth would you do that? But in that process, in that comment section, tons more stories bubbled up from a variety of sources. And that's simply by opening up the format and saying we're no longer going to speak at you, we're going to speak with you and enable a format that encourages engagement and encourages a greater diversity of voices than what exists in a newsroom that can be very underrepresented.
That's a fantastic piece of advice, all of these. I'd like to open up now to questions, which are with such a diverse and widely respected
Everybody's just back
journalist.
from lunch.
Yeah, so they have lots of energy. They're not bogged down from lunch. So if you can come to the microphones or raise your hands if you can speak loudly. Here we go. And if it's directed to a certain person, Yusuf, Ethar, Nasya, let us know. And can you keep it to one question since we have limited time?
Actually, I wanted to sound a note of caution. May I do so? It's not a question. Your films were very full of energy and enthusiasm. I really liked it about that. But in the film, the short thing that you showed on rape survivors in India, they were clearly identifiable. That's against the law, especially if they're underage. So
You mean the documentary clip?
In the documentary. So there can be repercussions of such a thing. Secondly, just because the story is being told in their voice does not necessarily mean it is their story. You as a journalist could be carrying that story with you, and it just gets told in their voice. I'll give you an example. I met a Pakistani friend here, and he was saying that when he first came to India, one of the things that struck him most was the fact that women were going around in motorbikes, which he never found in Pakistan. Now, if he was making a documentary like you, he would probably show a lot of women zooming around, and this being a very powerful story, and he could interview a lot of Indian women saying how free they feel just to go around. I mean, that voice would be a genuine voice, but that would not be a genuine story.
To just give feedback on that, when we say let them do their own story, that doesn't mean that there's no journalism that goes on behind it, or stats, or verification, or a more comprehensive story. It's more of your editing of the story and the questions that you ask. You let them tell the story versus you as a presenter or you as the producer being the one who is actively saying it for them. So usually these are longer interviews. They'd be an hour, and then they're edited and framed with the statistics, the information, et cetera, to create a story that is told in their voice. As for your other one, I will follow up with my documentary team, but I'm pretty sure they all have permissions from parents and clearances, et cetera. You mean in the actual country? Yes, I know. We had to take down a story recently of the 8-year-old girl who was raped, but this was a couple of years ago. But I'll follow up for you.
I think the broader point of, when story selection, we all don't objectively choose what we write about or produce. Our own life experience adds to how we select what we make journalism about. That always happens no matter what, of course.
But then that's also why having teams helps, right? Having diverse newsrooms, people who can give, when I'm doing a story on LGBTQ rights or Muslim women or African Americans, when you have a newsroom who can then give their thoughts, people who have those shared experiences to help you, whether it's with your selection of people you're interviewing, the experts, even the reports and the data you're looking at, because you do as journalists have access to a variety of everything, to give you that feedback and that direction, that definitely helps a lot. So you're not just coming at it with your own biases.
Certainly. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just want to extend on that and just ask all of your question. How important, how crucial is diversity in the newsroom and diversity of all types? Like, say, for example, just a couple of days back, I was having a conversation with my editor asking for greater caste diversity because Indian newsrooms are notorious for being filled with upper caste individuals, males and men and women. So how important is it? Because we have a Brahmin, which is an upper caste reporter, upper caste woman reporter, reporting on stories of Dalit or lower caste individuals across the country. And she's doing some great stories, but it's still being done by upper caste individuals. So is it absolutely essential, would you say? And I would argue.
If you're privileged enough and lucky enough to work in a diverse newsroom, I would say it is a privilege. I work somewhere where I have never worked in such a diverse newsroom in my life. And it's such an incredible, not just to have your allies, but to have support, to find pitches and stories, and you're not alone. It's always a very lonely fight. We were just joking that this is the brownest panel here. But when you are working somewhere where you are the token minority, let's say, you are either sometimes framed as this is the person who does all those stories and is very lonely. Sometimes you can't get those pitches or you can't get those stories because they're not important enough, right? Especially if you work in organizations who have very clear, whether it's a domestic or particular issues that they care about, and you're like, well, this just happened in Afghanistan, and they're like, well, we don't really care. So it's very important in a multitude of ways. And as you really pointed out, it's very easy to be like race, religion, gender, but there's so many other different kinds of diversity. One thing, you were talking about caste, but one thing about journalism I've noticed, for example, and I will admit we definitely lack, is people from different social classes. Journalism, especially in the US, I would say, every resume that lands on my desk, maybe 50% of them are Berkeley students, which is, very elite and you're like, I never thought having a master's degree from Berkeley, which would make you less eligible. You're looking for people who can tell stories that come from communities, and that's not sometimes in journalism easy to do. So yeah, it's very important, and we should be fighting for it.
And just onto your point, as you rightfully said, there was a report done a few years ago that 80% of Indian editors were upper caste males, and if you can't bring that diversity into that pool, and that diversity is not unique to India, right? If you go to the New York Times or to the LA Times, you'll find that the majority of their journalists are far more educated, they're far more elitist than the average American. That's why they missed the Donald Trump coming and these kinds of things. So it's not unique to that space. But in an Indian news organization, you will find people of all castes in that building, whether it's the chaiwala, the guy that's serving your tea, whether it's the guy that's pressing the buttons in that lift. For me, it's about expanding your pool of storytellers and saying that it's no longer 5 or 10 reporters, it's now everybody in the organization. Let's give everybody the basic skill set to contribute story ideas.
And one good feedback on that is to make sure you get that ability to continue telling those stories is keep a track of the stories that do well, the stories that resonated with your audience, the feedback. You would be amazed at how many people, when you do those stories that no one is covering, would immediately, I've been interviewing this week very heavily. We're looking for jobs, if anyone knows, we're hiring pretty heavily. But we have so many stories that are like, why are there so many Filipino nurses in the US? Stories that are very niche, and you would see they resonate so much with a specific audience, which is like, oh my God, no one has ever told this story before. And then you keep that record, and then your editors will be much more likely to give you a chance to do those stories.
And in terms of educating future journalists, it's so important, which is the short answer to your question. Is it easy or practical? No. I would love to walk into a classroom at the start of semester and see a Chinese girl sitting in my classroom telling me that she wants to be a rugby reporter. It's not going to happen. It probably won't happen until I die, just because there are certain fields that people tend to go into, certain fields that people avoid. We try really hard, but the reality is I've taught a course that is so popular. It's not at my current place of employment, but it's at a different university. It was so popular that the entrance score just went up and up and up. And one year, you had to get 98%. So this is our equivalent of your high school score. To get 98%, you're in the top 2% of the states. So guess who applied for that course? All the most people graduating from the most prestigious private schools in Melbourne. So of course they only reflect a narrow sort of section of society. It's super important to have that diversity in the newsroom. In terms of trying to get that diversity, I'm at a loss. I couldn't answer that question in terms of how to get that diversity.
Also, who wants to be an enemy of the American people? It's kind of hard.
But would you recommend hiring policies that place that as a really important parameter? Because the argument we hear often is merit, but merit is often a flawed argument when you don't get different voices. Would you recommend that in hiring policies?
You also need more open-minded, and I don't need someone who has an undergraduate degree in journalism and has done 10 internships and has a master's in television. The field has changed so much, and the skill set needed to tell these stories, you don't just need to be able to shoot and edit, you have to have actually been out. Someone mentioned yesterday how all millennials are wanting to sit with their curated Twitter feeds and just find those stories, which I disagree with. You need to be out.
The challenge comes to manage that diversity, though. You can bring diverse voices into a newsroom, but I've learned in my personal experience, if that diverse voice contradicts the voice of the newsroom, you have a friction point there. You have a point where the news organization's got this editorial line and you come from a different set of values and perspectives and you come with this, and somebody's got to compromise.
You kind of need that, no? Like there's always talk about like, are you a good fit? But sometimes maybe you need someone who doesn't quite fit.
Yeah, but sometimes they don't want that voice. They want you to conform. You come with your color, but not with your voice. And so that's for one. And for two, you can very easily be boxed as a person of color, as a minority in a newsroom. I had an experience when I was working in South Africa, and Tony Blair came to speak in South Africa. And I had a news editor say to me that, I'm not sure if you should cover this because you're Muslim. You might have a bias because of the stuff that happened in Iraq. This assumed bias because of your name, because of your religion. So managing diversity is just as difficult as bringing it on board.
This is a really good line of conversation. I want to keep on having it, but we should also move on to the next question. And there's several, and I'll also add, I think political diversity is very important in the newsroom too. We don't have a lot of that in the US. Over
Hi.
here.
Yes, my name is Devianti. I'm a freelance journalist from Jakarta. And I just want to share a little bit of a personal story, very, very short. I was inspired to become a journalist by watching Connie Chung on television when I grew up in New York City. But decades later, I'm seeing a lot of issues as well around diversity in the media, working in Jakarta. But the issue is having women wearing the hijab become anchors. That's the issue that was a few years ago in Indonesia. I have a friend of mine who was literally shut down in becoming a host of a program because she decided to wear the hijab. Before, she was a very popular anchor in one of the television stations in Indonesia. So the issue of diversity is not just about bringing in more ethnic, but also religious diversity in the newsroom. But my question is to Nasya, what is being done in Australia? And perhaps this could also be answered by Yusuf in relation to what's going on in the UK and also in the US. What's being done to introduce more ethnic and religious diversity in the newsroom? Because now there are more hijabi women in Indonesia that are reporters and are anchors, and that's due to a push, an internal push from within the newsroom, from editors and from producers, and sometimes from the reporters themselves saying, give me a chance. I'm a hijabi, but I can do whatever any other woman who's now wearing the hijab can do. So there's an internal push factor. Now, what's being done in the three countries, Australia, UK, and the US?
Short and depressing answer is very, very little. So from a journalism academics perspective, I'm not the only one who does this. I know a lot of my colleagues do this. And that is with the lack of diversity in their classrooms, they try to encourage their students to think about the way that they tell stories. Each university does tend to try and encourage, they have a quota in each course. And the quota is to encourage Indigenous Australians from a rural, migrant, refugee background to consider that particular course. That's on one side. On the other side is you simply don't get people from these backgrounds considering journalism as a career for a number of reasons. Historically, some groups have been treated quite badly, including Muslims, by the mainstream Australian press. The perceived lack of financial stability of a journalist is another factor. A lot of parents don't want their kids to choose to major in journalism. They want their children to enter safer professions, teaching, accounting, medicine, that sort of thing. So a lot of these migrant types of backgrounds include parents who moved to Australia from somewhere else, worked in factories. They don't want their kids working in factories, and they want their kids to succeed. And you can do that in a country that's quite egalitarian like Australia. But journalism's just not popular for them. So it's a very, very long road. In the meantime, what we have to work with is trying to incorporate diversity into our curriculum and encouraging our existing student bodies who are not diverse in any way and who don't reflect the diversity in Australia's population to think about the stories that they tell, to think about the interviewees they choose, and to better train them to deal with stories about diversity. Past couple of days, we've seen our World Cup presenter, Lucy Zelic, of Croatian background. She's brilliant at what she does, and she's copping a lot of flack because she doesn't anglicise the pronunciation of the soccer players' names. Okay, so if you think about how ridiculous that is, she pronounces the names the way they're meant to be pronounced in the soccer players' countries of origin, and people are criticising her for it. Right? Utterly, utterly insane. It shows how insular some parts of Australian society are. So we've got, sadly, a long, long way to go.
Protest by reporters. So I worked at E-News Channel Africa in South Africa. And there was a policy that African women were not allowed to wear the doek, the head covering. You guys actually covered it as a piece, which is a ridiculous notion that Africa's first 24-hour news network can't dress like Africans. We must conform to suit and tie and this sort of Western standard of what an anchor and a reporter should look like. And the reporters protested and they won. And now women are allowed to dress how they like. So maybe it requires a collection of the in-house media to oppose it.
I'd also say it just takes time. So like 10 years ago in Egypt, I was a guest twice a week to present the news because women in hijab were not allowed. But you know, it just takes time. Also, the more you see people on TV and hear people that don't look as they used to, the more it'll change. It just takes time.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Question to Yusuf. I see that your diversity stories have a huge geographical spread, and you travel extensively in highlighting this diversity stories. Can I ask two questions? I understand that you're independent, and how do you finance all these trips and your team behind you? And is there a revenue model that you have to stay independent, and are you in total editorial control of what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the most frequent question I get asked. We've been to 40 countries in 4 months. Who the hell's paying for all of it? Effectively, we're like Robin Hood. We piggyback off the back of conferences like this, and we use this as an opportunity to empower communities around. We've relied for the last 7 months on conferencing and speaking and consulting, but we've now moved into a content marketing space, and it's really exciting. The internet is becoming a lot smaller. In the old days, a marketer would want to sponsor or advertise with ABC, who has 20 million followers, about something. Today, if Nike want to do a promotion specifically to women who wear hijab in Ramallah, Palestine, they don't need to market to 20 million people. They need to market to my group, which has 50 runners who wear hijab. So in getting into these minority groups, in getting into really niche-focused audiences and cultivating those around social media groups and WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups, you end up with a hard-to-reach audience that nobody else has access to, that are highly, highly engaged, and you can start selling on that. And that's what we've started to do. So we're self-funded globally. In South Africa, we're backed by the Media Development Investment Fund. And the reason we can do it and the reason we can sell content marketing in a way that nobody else can is because we've got such niche audiences, and niche audiences are valuable today. So it doesn't just make sense to be philanthropic and diverse. You can be diverse because it actually makes business sense.
I would also say you brought up a really good point in the importance of being selective in your stories, because most media organizations will have a bottom line. They will have kind of a quota of how many of these kind of stories they can invest in. And if you try and be like, I want to do all the diversity, I want to do all the stories, you'll fail. You'll have to choose. So AJ Plus is pretty also lucky in the sense that we don't have monetary requirements as funded by Al Jazeera. But even so, we still have broad buckets of issues that we have decided these are the issues we focus on. They intersect with both what our audience wants and what our mission is. So things like indigenous issues. Because social justice is such a huge theme, you choose 6, so the environment, LGBT rights, exclusion or inclusion, you choose those, and based on those, you develop your specialization. And that'll really help develop that voice and make sure that you can continue to tell those stories.
Yes, sir, you've been waiting very patiently.
No, thank you. Yeah, I'm Keith Richburg. I teach at Hong Kong University, teach journalism, but I spent 30-some odd years with the Washington Post. And when I first went in the Washington Post newsroom in 1978 as a summer intern, there were not very many people of color. And when you were a person of color, they assigned you to a beat that they jokingly called ruins, which was riots, urban affairs, Indians, and Negroes. And that's all you could cover. And so my question, and the reason I get a little bit nervous when I hear this term about identity journalism is because it always leads to kind of a ghettoization. Let's hire black people to cover the riots. Let's hire Hispanic people to cover immigrants. And as I saw this happen at the Washington Post, when the Hispanic population started to grow, they said, oh, let's hire a bunch of Hispanic speakers so they can cover the Hispanic population. And so I guess I'm glad that when you mentioned it, Yusuf, about you have to manage diversity, not just have it. Because, as a reporter of color, I didn't want to cover that. I wanted to cover the White House. I wanted to cover politics. I wanted to cover Asia. So I made my name coming out to Asia, and everybody said, well, don't you want to go to Africa instead? So I guess my 2 questions really: how do you guard against how do you guard against this ghettoization when you have diversification in the newsroom? Because in my view, that's leading towards a path where we're getting up to the point almost there, where we're going to say, well, you have to be Chinese to be sent to China. You have to be African to go to Africa. Or how could you possibly cover the Middle East if you're not Middle Eastern? So that's, how do you guard against going down that path?
I'll really quickly jump in. This exact same thing happened to me. My first job out of my undergraduate degree was in a newsroom where they literally threw every Muslim story at me, anything to do with Muslims. So I just bided my time. And I thought, one day, I'll try and do as well as I can with this, quasi-imaginary beat of Muslim reporter that they've given to me. Eventually, after a couple of quite solid podcasts that I did involving Muslim-Christian violence in Ambon, in Indonesia, I felt brave enough to pitch a story that didn't have anything to do with Muslims. And I remember my editor looking at me going, okay, all right, I think you can do that. And then from then on, and these days I tell my students, if you happen to be female and you want to do a really strong political story, don't be afraid of pitching it. Because it's crazy, but in this day and age, they still get the fashion, beauty, makeup stories when they might want to do the political stories. A couple of years ago, one of my students of Lebanese background wore a headscarf, became the first Muslim reporter at News Corp, which is the main commercial media news organisation in Australia, owned by Rupert Murdoch, and they did not know what to do with her. They literally rang me up and said, how can we support this, how can we support this reporter? And I said to them, don't give her any Muslim stories. It's the best way to deal with it.
I also, obviously, went through the exact same thing. So I think in a position now, I'm an editor of a newsroom, I'm very conscious of the fact that you rotate producers, especially because digital newsrooms are usually equipped with very young producers, so people who are maybe a year or 2 or 3 out of school. They still don't have that experience. They're still trying to figure out what they want. One thing in the hiring process when we talk about diversity I didn't mention is diversity in passions and interests. Kind of figuring out what's their beat, what's the thing that really makes them shine. Not only do they make the story so much better, but it also gives them that chance for me to be like, all right, I'll let you do that kind of story. So I try and rotate producers, mix it up a little bit. So one day I'll be like, oh, my South Asian producer who always pitches the Indian story, let me give her the story on like what happened in Yemen, or let me give her this tech story. And sometimes actually they don't like it when they become really comfortable in that beat. So I mix it up every couple of weeks, rotate their beat, and then figure out what they want and give them those small opportunities to pursue larger stories within that framework. So they also get a chance to be in the field and interview. But it has to be very conscious because sometimes, yes, you can fall very easy. Oh, they speak Arabic. Oh, they're really familiar with the NGOs that are operating in Karachi. So they'll do those stories rather than someone who has to do the legwork from the beginning.
So we have room for one last question, Susan? One last question, all right.
Yeah, hi. I'm Shakir from Kuwait. I just want to ask you, how do your papers cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Just an easy last question.
How many years do you have?
The presence of Muslims in the newsroom, has it changed the pro-Israel bias of your media, especially Ethar and Jaweed?
I would like another question. It's complicated, let's put it that way. AJ Plus is owned by Al Jazeera, so obviously it's very easy to be like it is obviously very pro-Palestinian. We have run into issues when we do feature stories that are, more comprehensive, let's say. But one thing I will definitely say is that having a newsroom where you do have people who where the newsroom values or the organization values are aligned with pro-Palestine stands make it then easier to pursue more character-driven stories. So I have a lot more funding to, go send a VJ to shoot the settlement being built and homes being destroyed. I get more capacity and more support for those stories. So we get to humanize the conflict a lot more. When I first joined, I think our very first, that was Operation Protective Edge. So we got to do that every day, right? So you get to, if not balance out coverage, you at least get to produce a lot more coverage to make sure that those voices are also being heard. But this is obviously one of the more thornier, complicated, especially as an organization that is based in the United States.
We're most active in 4 countries, and Palestine is one of them. We believe that you should be fair, you should be truthful, you should be honest, you should be accountable, but we think that being down the middle on every story is bullshit. If you're not on the side of #MeToo, you're on the wrong side. If you're not on the side of Black Lives Matter, you're on the wrong side. And we take a definite stand when it comes to Palestine, and we believe the saying that Nelson Mandela went with, that until the people of Palestine are free, the people of South Africa can't be free. And we're very, very clear about the stand.
I'd also add, sorry, one more thing, is that we also get then a chance to do a lot of stories that aren't about the conflict, which is also great, that every Palestine story doesn't just have to be like, oh, look what happened again on the border, more shootings. You get to present the story in a way when we talk again about attention span and retention and people actually paying attention, so that the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people isn't just boxed into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what's going on.
And we hammer home that the Australian Journalists Union has a code of ethics which has recognised that the whole notion of being completely objective is bullshit. So they've changed that and they've said, don't be objective, be fair, right? So, and I tell my students that. I had a student wanting to do that story, and she said, do you think I'll be biased being Jewish? And I said, not at all. You just stick to the code of ethics and get, as many sides of the story as you can. And then she disappointed me by saying, all right, I'll just do a story on Jewish Tinder instead. And I said, okay. But I would have liked to have seen her story on it. But she decided that it was going to be a little bit difficult.
And exactly as Ethar said, you have to check people's prejudice. We also don't focus on a crying kid in Gaza because you've seen that for the last 70 years. We focus on solutions-based storytelling. We'll say, hey, here's the best hipster coffee shop in Ramallah. Here's the... Yeah, it's really good. It was a great story. Watch it. Share it. Subscribe. We did the first fruit and veg organic food truck in Palestine. We focus on stories that you would never imagine around Palestine because, again, it's not even a philanthropic thing. Young people don't share despair. We've been tired of terrorism and fear-mongering and hatred. We share optimism and hope and positivity. And this is why when we tackle Palestine, it's all about check your prejudice. Here's what you think about it, and here's what it actually is.
If I want to just add, I do want to just add a last comment, is that we often joke a lot that AJ Plus is the buzzkill, so that we are here to always tell you about the trauma and the tragedy and the horror of the world, which, there is a lot of. But one thing it's been almost 5 years then, we've kind of realized, especially as you talk to a younger audience, and this is your goal, it's not just the identities that matter, it's also solutions, it's also hope, it's also resonating with people in the shared humanity. One thing we try, or at least in most of the stories, which is you are presenting not just this is what is, but what can we do? One of our biggest questions that we get is, what can I do? This is always like, you've shown me this really horrible story, or this really, especially when it comes to characters, right? So many of my stories are individual characters, like this child who lost his legs, or they're very horrible stories, and other than like, here's the GoFundMe, what can we do to actually affect change? And this is definitely a line we toe as an organization, again, when you're talking about balance, and you have a tone, and you definitely have a brand, and we've built our brand on that, right? AJ Plus is clearly, we have a voice, we clearly aren't wishy-washy on a lot of issues, but then you toe the line between, well, we're not activists, we're still journalists, we're only presenting that image. To find that balance where you are still providing hope in the world and you're not just showing tragedy, you are providing solutions, and you are finding that space for your audience to engage and share, has become really important as people choose where they consume their news. There's just so much choice, and if I go back to millennials and being loyal to a brand, what is the value you as a news organization you stand for and you believe in? Those are things that are really important also when you choose your choice, you choose your news, because that is how we consume our news. I remember when I was a kid, and there's only like 2 or 3 places you get your news. I have like hundreds and hundreds of places to choose my news. Why would I watch this organization, or why would I widen my horizon? So they have to be organizations that either unfortunately align exactly with my views, and then that's part of the bubble and the problem. But if you're very conscious of what you stand for, it then helps a lot when you choose your stories, and makes sure that you continue, when you do them fairly, you will hopefully reach audiences that are beyond those audiences. And that's kind of the way I try and think of the work.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Yusuf, Ethar, and Nasya, and for all the great questions.